A street that ran with blood and beer, and no one thought it strange. This wasn't war. This was Tuesday. And the smell, a mix of sweat, smoke, and something that probably used to be a goat. It clung to you, in your hair, your clothes, your teeth. And after a while, you stopped noticing. I'm Boris, and tonight we're going to walk through that smell. Not in search of glory, not for battles or kings, but for the ordinary, the overlooked lives that history left in the margins. For the people who lived beside cesspits, prayed through plagues, and invented beauty where there was mostly rot. Because before there were cities of light, there were cities of stink. And somewhere in those streets, beneath the ash, the bread crusts, and the wet wool, you'll find the real Middle Ages. Welcome. Let's breathe it in. Before you saw a medieval city, you smelled it. It struck you first, not softly, not gradually, but all at once, like walking into a wall of heat laced with rot. 100 different odors, some identifiable, most not, rolled off the streets and into your lungs. Spoiled fish, human sweat, manure, smoke, stale beer, urine, and the vague sharpness of animal fat that had been left to harden in a pot days ago. There was no escape from it. If you lived in a city like Paris, London, Prague, or Florence in the 13th or 14th century, this was the air you breathed from birth to death. And yet no one talked about it, not because it wasn't unbearable by modern standards, but because it was simply what life smelled like. There was no concept of deodorized space, no sterile hospital scent, no pine-scented cleanser or perfume to mask the truth. The smell wasn't the exception, it was the environment. And the medieval nose adapted, if only because it had no other choice. Start with the streets. Medieval cities were not lined with cobblestones, at least not most of them. Roads were dirt or mud, riddled with potholes and ruts, and covered in waste. Waste from animals, horses, oxen, dogs, goats. Waste from people, chamber pots emptied from second-story windows, piss pots poured out near shop fronts, children peeing in alleyways. In some places, a shout of "Gardez-vous" from the French "Regardez-l'eau," watch out for the water, warned passers-by of incoming waste, but more often you simply learn to dodge. Now imagine that in summer. Heat didn't just rise, it fermented. Manure baked into the roads, chamber pot remnants dried to the walls. Blood from butchering shops congealed in gutters. By midday, the scent was alive. It swelled and curled in waves down alleyways. Meat markets with no refrigeration displayed their goods openly. Cuts of pork swarming with flies, intestines spilling over wooden counters, tubs of half-coagulated blood left uncovered in the sun. The blood would be sluiced out onto the street at the end of the day. It was common to see red rivulets running along the road, a kind of daily exhale of the city's stomach. And then there was the smoke. Every home burned something, wood, peat, dung, to cook and keep warm. But there were no chimneys in most homes until the late medieval period. Smoke pooled under ceilings, leaked through eaves, and hung in narrow alleys like fog. In the evenings, when every hearth was lit, the city seemed cloaked in a grey veil, with the smell of burning dung mingling with boiling cabbage and overcooked onions. Clothes absorbed it, Hair reeked of it. If you stood in the street too long, your skin did too. Bathing did exist. Public bathhouses were common in many cities, especially in earlier centuries, but access was inconsistent. Hot water was expensive. Soap made from animal fat and lye was harsh and not always available. And for the poor, washing regularly meant either wasting precious firewood or braving icy streams. Most simply didn't. Instead, they layered clothing, scrubbed their hands with sand or ash, and lived with the stink. Churches tried to intervene. Incense was more than ceremony. It was a kind of olfactory warfare. Swinging censers didn't just sanctify the air, they masked the unbearable, however briefly. Priests and monks burned myrrh, frankincense and sage, not only for spiritual significance, but because they were standing in rooms packed with unwashed bodies, mouldy stone and rat droppings. Sometimes attempts at cleanliness made things worse. Rushes, straw or reeds, were laid on floors to absorb moisture and spills. They weren't changed often. Beneath them built up layers of rot, spilled ale, dog urine, fish guts, vomit, sweat. In wealthier homes, dried herbs were sprinkled in among the rushes, lavender, thyme, rosemary. But no amount of mint could conquer 6 months of filth beneath your feet. And yet, no one left the city because of the smell. Cities were dangerous, yes, full of disease and violence, but they also offered opportunity, protection, and proximity to power. The olfactory cost was simply part of the deal. What about rivers? Surely they offered some relief.
Hardly. Rivers were used as sewers. The Thames, the Seine, the Vltava all bore the runoff of latrines, butchers' stalls, tanneries and dye works. In some places you could smell a river before you saw it. Fish died en masse. Algae bloomed in waves, but people still drank from it, washed in it, built homes beside it. The logic was circular. Water is life, but also death. It's where we clean and also where we dispose. Children grew up in this sensescape. They knew which alley smelled worst in summer, which butcher left his offal out too long, and when the tanneries dumped hides into the ditch behind the monastery wall. They learned to hold their breath. They learned not to question the stink. It was as much a part of the city as its stones and towers. It wasn't that medieval people had no sense of smell. On the contrary, their noses were finely tuned, but their interpretation of odour was different. Bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were seen as dangerous. The miasma theory that disease was carried in foul air dominated medical thinking. So, when plagues hit, people burned aromatic herbs, carried pomanders, and covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar. These weren't superstitions, they were defences. Smell was survival. And when someone did smell good, when a noble passed with perfume, or a rich merchant's home was filled with orange blossoms, it stunned the senses. Cleanliness in a city like this was not a standard, it was a signal, a kind of quiet announcement that you were not one of the crowd. But for everyone else, for the cobbler's apprentice, the fishwife, the boy who swept stalls at the abbey, smell was an inheritance. It lingered in blankets, clung to wooden bowls, seeped into boots and skin. It was passed from generation to generation, not by intention, but by immersion. To live in a medieval city was to breathe the city, every part of it. And though the perfumes of history have long since faded from parchment and stone, the truth remains inescapable. The Middle Ages didn't just look different, they smelled like nothing you can imagine.
In the modern world, sanitation is mostly invisible. Toilets flush, pipes drain, and waste disappears behind tiled walls and beneath paved streets. But in the medieval city, there was no such magic. Human waste was public business, visible, smelly, and deeply entwined with everyday life. Start with the basics: chamber pots. These were the most common method of human waste collection, used by nearly everyone from peasants to nobles. At night, rather than stumbling into a freezing courtyard or alley, people relieved themselves into clay or metal pots kept near the bed. The trouble, of course, came in the morning, when these pots had to be emptied. And this is where things got complicated. There were no municipal waste systems, no sewage grids or septic tanks. What you did with your chamber pot was your own problem. For most, the solution was simple: open the window and throw. Some gave a shout, a traditional gardy-loo in Scotland, or similar warnings in other languages. But often the contents came without notice, cascading down walls and splashing onto streets already slick with mud and manure. Some households had cesspits, sunken brick or stone-lined holes in the ground meant to collect human waste, but these filled quickly. Once full, they required professional cleaners, gong farmers as they were known in England. Gong farmers worked at night, shoveling and carting human waste from latrines, cesspits and ditches to dumping sites outside the city walls. The job was so foul that it was well paid by medieval standards, but it came with serious risks: asphyxiation from fumes, disease, and social exclusion. Gong farmers were not welcome in polite company, even though society couldn't function without them.
In cities with denser populations, larger public latrines might exist, often attached to bridges, monasteries, or castles. The famous long drops of castles were stone chutes that funneled waste directly down exterior walls or into moats. In Paris, some of the larger bridges had latrines built along their spans, letting people relieve themselves straight into the Seine. Similar structures existed across Europe. The logic was brutal but consistent. If it flows away, it's no longer your problem. Unfortunately, away usually meant into rivers, canals, or shallow pits dug behind buildings. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Rivers like the Thames or Seine were less bodies of water and more open sewers, teeming with bacteria and filth. And yet, people still drank from them. They still washed clothes, filled cooking pots, and baptized babies in them. Boiling was common, but not universal. Many simply hoped for the best. Even monasteries, centers of cleanliness and order in the medieval world, struggled with sanitation. Though some abbeys had complex systems of water flow and waste channels, others relied on the same methods as townspeople: chamber pots and pits. The difference was in discipline. Monks often had rules about when and how to relieve themselves, and elaborate schedules for cleaning latrines. Still, disease found its way in. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and worse could move quickly in even the most pious cloisters. The smell was constant. It wasn't just an unfortunate background note, it defined entire neighborhoods. Streets near tanneries, dye works, or markets were already pungent, but the worst were those near cesspits. The stench seeped into walls, into hay mattresses, into bread left too long on the counter. Flies swarmed year-round, rats flourished, and children played in the alleys anyway, because that was life. Wealth offered some insulation, but not escape. Noble homes had guardrobes, primitive toilets built into thick stone walls, often overhanging a moat or a waste chute. These were slightly more private, but far from clean. The smell still crept upward through cracks and floorboards. Servants still had to clear out messes by hand. And parasites, lice, fleas, worms, respected no social class. What did people do about it? Some burned aromatic herbs or incense. Others hung flowers, wore scented pouches, or dabbed vinegar under their noses. In wealthier homes, perfumed candles were used during meals to combat the ambient stink. But none of these efforts did much more than create a temporary illusion of control. At best, they layered one scent over another, rosewater masking urine, frankincense softening the edges of human decay. The most organized efforts came during crises. Plagues prompted temporary cleanup campaigns as cities sought to purge bad air. Waste collectors were mobilized, streets were washed, latrines scrubbed. But once the crisis passed, old habits returned. The labor was too intense, the costs too high, and the stink, once normalized, was easier to live with than to fight. To modern sensibilities, the lack of sanitation seems unthinkable. But it was also universal. No medieval city was clean by our standards. Even the grandest capitals stank. Even the richest streets had gutters running with filth. It was part of the medieval condition, a constant presence, a silent equalizer. And while history remembers kings and battles, inventions and art, it often forgets this basic truth. The people of the Middle Ages lived surrounded by their own waste, managed it with bare hands and stoic faces, and somehow carried on. In the end, the medieval city wasn't just built on stone. It was built on what was left behind, in every corner, in every alley, and under every floorboard.
If the medieval cities stank, and it absolutely did, then its people did not simply accept it without resistance. They adapted, they improvised, and in some cases, they turned the battle against smell into an art form. The first and most obvious response was washing. But bathing in medieval Europe was a complicated affair, not because people hated cleanliness, but because public infrastructure didn't make it easy. Full-body bathing required hot water, clean towels, and privacy, three luxuries rarely found together. In many towns, public bathhouses filled this gap. These were not only places to get clean, but to socialize, eat, rest, and even engage in less reputable activities. Some bathhouses were simple wooden structures with heated tubs and benches. Others were elaborate buildings with multiple rooms, steam chambers, and attendants. They were especially common in cities influenced by Roman traditions, or in regions of the Islamic world where hygiene was deeply embedded in daily religious practice. Contrary to the myth that people in the Middle Ages never bathed, many did when they could afford to. Wealthy homes might have tubs or wash basins, but heating water was time-consuming and soap was expensive. For the poor, cleanliness came in stages: rinsing hands and faces,
washing feet, changing linens. Complete immersion was rare, but not unknown. Soap itself varied in quality and availability. Lye-based soaps made from animal fat were common but harsh. Finer, scented soaps made with olive oil or herbs were imported or produced in wealthier regions. These were used sparingly, reserved for special occasions or social display. To smell of soap was to smell of money. For those without access to baths or soap, the next line of defense was masking the smell. This is where perfumes, herbs, and aromatic accessories entered everyday life. Small cloth pouches called pomanders were filled with fragrant herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, thyme, and worn around the neck or pinned to clothing. Wealthier individuals carried carved metal pomanders filled with solid perfume, swinging gently from belts or chains. Women sometimes tucked dried flowers into their bodices. Men dabbed scent on their collars or beards. The idea wasn't to remove odor, it was to overpower it. Clergy and physicians often carried vinegar-soaked cloths or posies of strong-smelling herbs when visiting the sick. These were not just protective against smell, but were believed to ward off disease, based on the theory of miasma, that illness traveled through bad air. A well-scented handkerchief could be a literal lifesaver in the minds of the time. Markets sold dried herbs in bundles for burning, steeping, or hanging. During festivals or feast days, streets were sometimes strewn with rushes and fragrant plants, not just for decoration, but to suppress the stench of garbage and excrement. In wealthier homes, fresh herbs were scattered across floors or placed in pots near doorways. Some castles had designated scent gardens, full of aromatic plants used for cooking, medicine, and perfuming the air. Still, smell was not always seen as a problem to be solved. In some cases, it became part of identity. Occupational smells, the smoke of a blacksmith, the fish of a monger, the must of a vintner, clung to people like a badge. For the lower classes, odor was simply part of life. What mattered more was avoiding unnatural or offensive smells, the kind associated with rot, disease, or death. Public health campaigns occasionally attempted to intervene. In plague years, city leaders would order latrines scrubbed, bathhouses cleansed, and fragrant fires burned in the streets. Barrel fires of juniper, resin, or pitch were meant to cleanse the air. Aromatic waters were sprinkled on doorways or church floors, but these measures were temporary, reactionary, and rarely consistent. One of the few constants was religious bathing. Certain religious orders required regular washing as a spiritual discipline. In Jewish communities, mikveh baths ensured ritual purity. In Islamic cities like Cordoba or Cairo, public baths, or hammams, were centers of both hygiene and community. In contrast, Christian Europe saw a gradual decline in public bathing by the later Middle Ages, due in part to concerns about immorality and disease spread. Interestingly, smell itself became a form of moral judgment. To reek of sweat or waste was not just a nuisance, it was a mark of disorder, sin, or poverty. Conversely, to be clean and scented suggested godliness, discipline, and social standing. This association only grew stronger in the centuries to come, culminating in the obsession with hygiene during the Enlightenment and beyond. Despite all these efforts, the truth remained. The smell never really left. At best, people pushed it back for an hour, a day, a feast. They fought it with herbs, vinegar, water, prayer. But the rot was always waiting, in the alley, in the basin, in the warm corners of the bread shop. And people adapted. They stopped noticing, or they noticed too much. To walk through a medieval city was to walk through a sensory gauntlet. 1 minute, incense and roasted meat. The next, dung and mildew. Every step was a shift in atmosphere, every turn an olfactory surprise. And in that chaos, people found a strange kind of balance. Because even as they fought the stink, they lived with it. And they lived fully, laughing, loving, trading, feasting, in a world that never quite smelled right.
In the medieval city, smell wasn't just sensory, it was social. It divided classes, professions, genders, and even levels of perceived morality. What you smelled like wasn't merely an accident of labor or environment. It was often interpreted as a signal of where you belonged in the social order. Among the upper classes, the absence of smell became an ideal. It wasn't enough to be perfumed. The goal was to smell of nothing human at all. Only roses, citrus, cloves, or soap. This was a luxury because it required layers of intervention, multiple changes of linen, fresh herbs or oils daily, access to clean water, and servants to help maintain the illusion. The cleaner and more neutral the scent, the further removed one was from the street, the market, the field. Clothing played a significant role in this olfactory hierarchy. Fine fabrics like silk and linen absorbed fewer odors than wool or hemp, and they were washed more frequently. Noblemen sometimes scented their garments directly by storing them in trunks with herbs or using sachets sewn into seams. A nobleman entering a chamber smelling faintly of orange blossom or clove oil was making a statement. He had no reason to sweat. By contrast, the working classes smelled of the world. A butcher carried the scent of raw flesh, a tanner of lime and skin, a cook of fire and fat. These scents were not entirely shameful. They marked a man or woman as productive, but they also confined them socially. A perfumed noblewoman might smile at a fishmonger on the street, but she would never sit beside him at table. Smell enforced the invisible boundaries of class, keeping people in their place even in crowded spaces. In churches, scent marked spiritual elevation. Incense, frankincense, and myrrh was more than a ritual. It was meant to lift prayers, yes, but also to cleanse the air, sanctify the space, and separate the sacred from the profane. The scent of incense clinging to a priest's robes signaled holiness. To smell like a saint was to smell like smoke and spice, not sweat and straw. Even punishment carried olfactory messaging. In some cities, convicted criminals were made to wear filthy garments or stand near dung heaps as part of public shaming. The stench was intentional, a literal stink of sin. Conversely, saints and holy figures were sometimes said to emit pleasant aromas in death, a miracle known as the odor of sanctity. Scent was not just symbolic, it was spiritual currency. Among women, the stakes were even more complicated. A well-scented woman was desirable, but only within bounds.
Smelling too strong of perfume could suggest vanity, or worse, promiscuity. A lady's scent was meant to be discovered, not announced. Thus, perfumed gloves, embroidered handkerchiefs, and floral hair oils became the weapons of subtle allure. Her cleanliness, and therefore her virtue, was something to be quietly noticed, not loudly declared. In the court, fragrance became weaponized politics. A noble might gift another with perfumed objects, fans, writing parchment, or even food. These gifts could signal favor, insult, or obligation, depending on the scent chosen. A particularly rare fragrance could be both a compliment and a reminder of one's dependence. Even the choice to burn incense in private quarters could be read as asserting one's piety or challenging someone else's. Perfume production itself was an elite business. Apothecaries and perfumers often served royalty and clergy. Recipes were guarded secrets, passed between trusted hands or codified in Latin texts. The ability to scent one's household, rooms, bedding, even livestock pens was a mark of immense wealth. At the highest levels of power, entire rooms were perfumed with herbs burned in special braziers or flowers scattered across rush-strewn floors.
Yet for all this effort, smell remained democratic in one essential way. It was unavoidable. A nobleman might scent his person, but he still had to pass through the streets. A priest might wave a censer, but the sick still coughed in the pews. A duchess might perfume her wig, but it sat atop a sweating scalp. The air didn't always respect status. As urban populations grew, so too did the awareness that controlling smell meant controlling perception. City councils began issuing edicts to clean certain areas, not out of compassion, but to preserve reputations. The alley near the bishop's residence had to smell better than the one near the tanner's quarter. Smell became a kind of municipal branding. The Revolution would later mock all of this. Satirists and pamphleteers delighted in portraying aristocrats as so obsessed with scent that they couldn't smell the rot of their own kingdom. Perfumed wigs, powdered faces, lavender gloves, these became symbols of a class too distracted by fragrance to notice the coming fire. In one popular satire, a noblewoman flees Paris not because of danger, but because her perfumer has closed shop. And yet, even as the world changed, smell remained a quiet language. It whispered things that words could not. It reminded people who they were, where they had been, what they had eaten, and who they had touched. In a time before antibiotics or deodorant, before sealed windows or air filtration, smell was the body's diary and society's invisible map. To live in a medieval city was to breathe 1,000 stories at once. Some sweet, some bitter, some you'd never forget, even if you tried.
If the medieval cities stank, and it absolutely did, then its people did not simply accept it without resistance. They adapted, they improvised, and in some cases, they turned the battle against smell into an art form. The first and most obvious response was washing. But bathing in medieval Europe was a complicated affair, not because people hated cleanliness, but because public infrastructure didn't make it easy. full body bathing required hot water, clean towels, and privacy, three luxuries rarely found together. In many towns, public bathhouses filled this gap. These were not only places to get clean, but to socialize, eat, rest, and even engage in less reputable activities. Some bathhouses were simple wooden structures with heated tubs and benches. Others were elaborate buildings with multiple rooms, steam chambers, and attendants. They were especially common in cities influenced by Roman traditions, or in regions of the Islamic world, where hygiene was deeply embedded in daily religious practice. Contrary to the myth that people in the Middle Ages never bathed, many did when they could afford to. Wealthy homes might have tubs or wash basins, but heating water was time-consuming and soap was expensive. For the poor, cleanliness came in stages: rinsing hands and faces, washing feet, changing linens. Complete immersion was rare, but not unknown. Soap itself varied in quality and availability. Lye-based soaps made from animal fat were common but harsh. Finer, scented soaps made with olive oil or herbs were imported or produced in wealthier regions. These were used sparingly, reserved for special occasions or social display. To smell of soap was to smell of money. For those without access to baths or soap, the next line of defense was masking the smell. This is where perfumes, herbs, and aromatic accessories entered everyday life. Small cloth pouches called pomanders were filled with fragrant herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, thyme, and worn around the neck or pinned to clothing. Wealthier individuals carried carved metal pomanders filled with solid perfume, swinging gently from belts or chains. Women sometimes tucked dried flowers into their bodices. Men dabbed scent on their collars or beards. The idea wasn't to remove odor, it was to overpower it.
Animal waste was even more prolific. Horses, oxen, dogs, chickens, pigs. Urban life was crowded with livestock. Horses alone produced an astonishing amount of manure daily. Without regular removal, it piled up. Street cleaners, when they existed, worked constantly, often losing the battle as fast as they fought it. In market districts, especially those near butcheries, the gutters ran red with blood and slick with fat. Hooves clopped through it all, spreading it further. Butchers were notorious for waste. Many operated near water sources for ease of washing carcasses, but this meant entrails, blood, and bones often made their way into public streams. Slaughter wasn't private or sanitary. It was visible, loud, and messy. People became accustomed to the sight and smell of animal remains. Children played nearby. Vendors hawked bread beside offal piles. Tanners, another vital profession, contributed their own unique brand of waste. Hides had to be soaked in urine and then washed in water. The mixture was poured into the street or into nearby pits. A tannery's location could devalue an entire neighborhood. The smell alone was enough to repel even the hardiest locals. And yet life went on. People stepped over puddles, scraped shoes clean with knives, hung dried herbs to mask the air inside homes. Sand or straw was scattered across floors to absorb moisture and reduce odor. Everyone had their methods. Linen rags soaked in vinegar were waved around noble households. In poorer areas, incense was burned. but mostly to hide the smell of the sick or dying. Interestingly, medieval people were not indifferent to filth. Many city councils passed cleanliness laws. Some towns designated waste collectors or required households to clean their stretch of street weekly. Fines were issued for dumping too close to churches, public buildings, or water sources. But enforcement was sporadic and often ignored. The sheer volume of waste overwhelmed even the most conscientious citizens.
Cesspits were common, but problematic. Dug in yards or cellars, they filled quickly. Some were lined with stone, others were just deep holes in the ground. When full, they had to be emptied by hand, another job done at night, for low pay, and often by marginalized workers. Leaks contaminated wells, the stench seeped through floorboards. In rainy seasons, pits overflowed. Public latrines existed, especially in monasteries or near large markets. But they were few and poorly maintained. Some were built over rivers, letting the current carry the waste away. Others became so disgusting that people avoided them entirely. It's no wonder that alleys, abandoned buildings, or secluded corners became unofficial toilets. The result was a cityscape in which the very air was shaped by waste. Smell wasn't just a background note, it was a character, a force. It dictated behavior. It marked the change of seasons more than any calendar. It was worse in summer. It lingered after storms. It curled under doors and through cracks. And for all the horror, it was normalized. People adapted. They joked. They complained. They lived. They developed stronger stomachs and lower expectations. It wasn't that they liked the smell, it's that they had no choice. Filth was a tax or proximity, a cost of living in a world without pipes or drains or sealed trash bags. Today, we think of filth as a failure, but in the medieval city, it was simply the baseline. And within that baseline, people still found joy, love, beauty, even poetry. They just did it while stepping carefully.
It wasn't hidden, it wasn't clean, and no one thought it strange. The butcher's quarter was the loudest, bloodiest, most viscerally medieval place in any city, and everyone passed through it, because that's where the food came from. Most medieval cities organized trades into neighborhoods, and the butchers, with their cleavers, saws, barrels of offal, and screaming livestock, were given their own space, usually near water, for practical, if unsanitary, reasons. Rivers and streams ran red in those areas, choked with animal parts and thick with fat. You could smell the butcher's lane long before you saw it. There was no refrigeration, no gloves, no stainless steel. A side of beef was hoisted with ropes, hacked by hand, and bled openly. Chickens fluttered, half plucked on hooks. Pigs were tied, squealing to posts as customers pointed out their selections, still living. Sheep were dragged by rope through crowds. Dogs lurked beneath the tables. Cats perched on beams. Flies came in clouds. Sanitation was an afterthought. The butcher's block was a worn slab of wood, blackened with years of blood and bone fragments. Blades were sharpened on stones still wet with entrails. Aprons were stiff with old stains. Floors were strewn with straw to soak up fluids, though by midday the straw was slippery pulp. And still, this was considered normal. These scenes, gory and frantic, were part of the daily rhythm of city life. Shoppers shouted over the noise, haggled, pointed, barked orders. Children darted through the mess. Vendors sold bread or wine just a few stalls down. Meat was central to urban diets, especially among wealthier classes, and that meant the butcher's quarter was essential. But it was also chaotic. Regulation existed but loosely. City authorities occasionally cracked down on waste disposal or unlicensed slaughter, but enforcement was patchy. Some butchers bribed officials, others ignored them. Guilds had their own rules, but discipline varied. The most successful butchers were often not the most skilled, but the most politically connected.
And then there was the matter of disposal. Bones, hooves, spoiled meat. It all had to go somewhere. In theory, refuse was removed at night, carted outside city walls or to designated pits. In reality, much of it stayed put. Piles formed behind shops or in alleys. Rats feasted openly. In warm months, the smell became unbearable. This waste didn't just offend the nose, it bred disease. The correlation between proximity to animal remains and outbreaks of plague or dysentery wasn't yet understood, but the effects were visible. The butcher's quarter often became the epicenter of illness, and yet people returned every day, because what was the alternative? Buying meat in the countryside meant cost and travel. Urban markets provided convenience. For all its filth, the butcher's quarter was efficient. It delivered what the city needed: protein, fat, bones for broth, even hides for tanning. Nothing was wasted entirely. Even the scraps had value, whether as food for the poor, bait for trappers, or raw material for glue. But this efficiency came with spectacle. A customer might stand beside a bucket of sheep heads. A boy might run errands through puddles of congealed blood. A noblewoman's servant might wait beside a severed calf's leg, holding a perfumed handkerchief to her nose. The sights weren't censored, and the sounds worse. Animals didn't go quietly. They screamed, gurgled, kicked. Axes thudded. Bones snapped. Cleavers rang against wood. Voices argued over price and weight. It was a concert of carnage, and yet, somehow, it normalized itself through repetition. The butchers themselves were both respected and feared. They held real economic power, controlling food supply, hiring laborers, and influencing city councils. But they were also mistrusted. Blood was an ambiguous thing. Too much contact with it, especially animal blood, was thought to stain the soul. Butchers were often seen as necessary, but spiritually dubious. Some cities banned them from serving on juries. Others denied them burial in consecrated ground. Their apprentices were often orphans or the sons of lower tradesmen. They started young, learning to skin, gut, and clean. Injuries were common, infection inevitable. A misplaced blade could mean lifelong damage. And yet, it was a path to stability. Master butchers could earn well, afford property, and pass their trade to sons. Public opinion, however, was volatile. During periods of famine or rising prices, butchers were easy scapegoats. Accused of hoarding, adulterating meat, or inflating prices, they were occasionally attacked by mobs. Shops were looted, scales smashed. The thin line between provider and villain was walked daily. And yet, amid the chaos, there was also craft. Skilled butchers prided themselves on clean cuts, on knowing how to break down an animal with minimal waste. They judged meat by smell, colour, tension of the flesh. Some developed signature cuts or cured specialities. Bacon, sausages, blood puddings, these weren't factory products. They were handmade, batch by batch. The quarter itself had a rhythm. Mornings were busiest, deliveries, slaughter, early customers. By afternoon, the best meat was gone, the worst remained. By evening, cleaning began, if cleaning happened at all. Buckets of water were thrown, but the stones never truly became clean. The blood soaked too deep. At night, the streets emptied. The butcher's lane grew quiet, but the smell remained. And in that smell was the memory of every animal, every bargain, every meal. It lingered on coats, in hair, on the breath of those who had shouted orders or swung blades. It was the scent of sustenance and survival, equal parts horror and necessity. This was not hidden history. It was right there, in the open. You just had to be willing to smell it.
If you lived in a medieval city, you didn't just smell it. You heard it, long before dawn, long after dark. And the sounds weren't background noise. They were part of your survival, your orientation, even your sense of identity. The stench of rot, waste, and smoke was constant, but overlaying it was a symphony of other signals. Clanging metal, animal brays, barking dogs, market cries, ringing bells, and the slow churn of wagon wheels over stone. Smell told you what you were near. Sound told you where you were within it. Take the tanner's quarter. Before your nose caught the scent of piss-soaked hides and rotting flesh, your ears might register the slap of wet leather or the rhythmic scraping of fat from skins. These weren't random noises. They were occupational signatures, alerts that guided you through the labyrinth of trade districts. A blacksmith's forge echoed through several streets, metal on metal, hiss of steam, the dull thud of the hammer. Even from a distance, the forge sang its location. You didn't need signs. You needed ears. And then there were bells. Churches rang them not just for prayer, but to mark time, summon help, or signal curfew. A single bell might toll a death. A sequence might mean fire. A long, urgent peal could signal invasion or riot. In an age with few clocks and no phones, the bell tower was the voice of the city. In wealthier neighborhoods, sound softened. The rustle of silk, a servant's footsteps, the pluck of a lute behind curtained windows. But these were exceptions. The average street was loud, and not in a modern mechanical way. It was organic, human, animal, constant.
Vendors shouted their wares with practiced rhythm. Fresh fish, still kicking. Hot pies, 2 for a penny. These cries competed for attention, evolving into local cadences unique to each city or district. A London fishmonger didn't sound like a Parisian bread seller. Each had their own inflection, pitch, and wordplay, a kind of street music, tailored to the ears of tired buyers. Children contributed their own noise, chasing, fighting, singing scraps of popular ballads. Dogs barked, roosters crowed, even inside city limits. Horses clattered past, iron shoes biting into cobblestone. Wheels groaned under weight. Somewhere, always, someone
was shouting. And always underneath was the slop. Carts dumped waste at corners or in canals. Buckets emptied from windows with a shout, if you were lucky. "Garde à l'eau," they might call in France. "Mind the water." In practice, that meant get out of the way unless you want to be soaked in someone else's dinner. The splash was unmistakable. The smell unforgettable. Every sound had a smell, and every smell had a sound. The dye maker's workshop smelled of ammonia and bark extract, and echoed with stirring paddles and draining vats. The candle maker reeked of tallow, but rang with the clink of moulds and the scrape of hardened wax. Bakers, when not overwhelmed by heat, filled the air with the crisp crack of crusts and the low hum of kneading hands. You learned to associate. The rhythm of footsteps on a certain bridge, slippery mould beneath. The rasping cough of chimney sweeps, soot in the air. The sudden silence in a crowded market, trouble coming. Silence, in fact, was rare and unsettling. A quiet square might mean curfew, or death, or something unspoken had just passed through. Holidays reversed the chaos into performance. Festival drums, pipers, singing, noise became celebration. Stalls were set up, musicians hired, and even beggars joined in with clanking cups and theatrical groans. The city became louder, but more joyful. The smells didn't change, but the way people responded did. Then came plague.
When disease struck, the city changed timber. Streets emptied, footsteps became wary. The cough of a neighbor triggered dread. Bell tolls increased. The scent of burning herbs mingled with the scent of decay. Processions of carts creaked by, loaded with bodies. Priests muttered prayers that couldn't be heard over the growing silence. Even without news, people felt the city shift. Through the nose, through the ear, a tension in the air. And yet life went on, because it had to. People adapted to the soundscape and stenchscape. They built resistance, not just of the body, but of perception. Visitors often described cities as unbearable, but residents, they stopped noticing. Or more precisely, they noticed differently. The smell of open sewage became just the canal. The cries of the dying became just the hospital street. The wheezing of an ox became just morning traffic. Desensitization was a coping mechanism and a necessity. But not everyone acclimated. Some used scent as status. Wealthier citizens burned herbs indoors or wore scented sachets. The wealthy paid for quieter homes, farther from the markets and filth. Perfume wasn't just luxury, it was armor. Still, no one escaped entirely. Even kings smelled their cities when the wind turned. Even bishops heard the cries in the street during feast days. The urban fabric was too tightly woven to avoid contact. And for historians, these lost layers of sound and scent are the hardest to recover. No drawing captures the stench. No manuscript records the exact pitch of a butcher's cry. These sensory histories exist only in reconstruction, in imagination, in the attempt to map an invisible world. But they were there. They shaped behavior, memory, even morality. The stench of rot taught caution. The cry of fire instilled fear.
The clamour of bells marked moments of joy and mourning alike. To understand a medieval city, you must do more than see it. You must hear it. You must smell it. And in doing so, you step closer, not to the monuments, but to the people who lived, breathed, and sweated within those streets.
When night fell on a medieval city, it didn't bring silence. It brought a new kind of chaos, slower, murkier, and more dangerous. The streets that bustled with market noise and midday trade turned into shadows, where sound and smell took on darker meanings. Street lamps, as we understand them, didn't exist. Illumination came from flickering torches, moonlight, or small oil lamps set in upper windows. Most of the city was cloaked in black. Only the wealthiest districts had even minimal lighting. Poorer quarters were swallowed whole by darkness. Shops closed. Stalls were dismantled. Church bells marked the curfew. After that, you weren't supposed to be outside unless you had permission and a lantern. But not everyone obeyed, and not everyone had a reason to. Thieves preferred night. So did informants, smugglers' runners, and those seeking anonymity for more personal motives. The streets weren't empty, they were unseen. Figures moved with cautious steps, conversations lowered to whispers. Rats scuttled across cobblestones, feeding on the day's refuse, joined by stray dogs and feral cats. The air changed after sunset. Without the heat of day to carry smells upward, odours settled. Smoke clung closer to the ground. Latrine stench grew heavier. Sewers, if they existed, overflowed. In summer, humidity thickened the miasma. In winter, cold trapped it low. The stillness made it worse. There was no breeze to clear it. Even indoors, the dark pressed close. Candles were rationed. Fires were banked low to conserve fuel. Families gathered in 1 or 2 rooms, shutting out the cold or the street noise with wooden shutters. The night was long, and nothing in the medieval world moved quickly except fear. Superstition thrived after dark. Every culture had its demons, and most of them came at night. Ghosts, devils, spirits that slipped in through cracks or whispered at the window. Entire towns believed that illness spread through nighttime air, and many refused to open windows after sunset. The association between rot, smell, and evil was visceral.
In cities, danger was often more mundane, but no less real. Fires started by an untended candle, violence in alleyways, drunken brawls outside taverns. Law enforcement, if it existed, was limited to a handful of watchmen who patrolled with sticks and bells. Their job was not to protect so much as to report. Intervention was rare. Some neighborhoods self-policed. Families took turns watching over communal areas. Dogs were encouraged to bark. Trust, not institutions, kept many communities safe, and even that was fragile. Taverns and inns became the only real centers of life after dusk. There, light, noise, and warmth offered brief escape. Drink flowed, songs rose, dice clicked on tables, but the crowd could turn fast. Arguments, jealousy, hunger, they simmered beneath the surface. And when a fight broke out,
There were no sirens, no help, just fists, knives, or worse. For the very poor, night was colder than just temperature. Many had no home. They slept beneath carts, in church alcoves, or huddled against oven walls if a baker took pity. Some didn't sleep at all. They scavenged, looking for anything the day had left behind. A bruised apple, a broken crate, a lost coin. And yet, amid the filth and fear, there were rituals. Night prayers whispered in Latin or old dialects, mothers singing children to sleep, lovers meeting in courtyards, students reading by the final stub of candle. Even in darkness, life adapted. But the city did not rest. Its underbelly simply turned over. By midnight, the bakers stirred, fires were lit, flour dust rose, markets prepared for morning, carters loaded grain, fishermen returned with their catch. The city breathed, not deeply, but steadily. Its rhythm reset, quietly, beneath layers of waste and worry.
And all the while the smells lingered. They crept through shutter cracks. They soaked into stone and cloth. They told stories no one wrote down. Of the child who coughed through the night, the apprentice who never came home, the fire that smouldered for hours before it was noticed. A medieval city did not sleep. It decomposed and regenerated slowly beneath the stars. What you smelled in the morning was only the surface. Night laid the groundwork, and if you listened closely, you'd hear it. The distant cartwheel, the soft cry, the muted echo of something lost between prayers and gutters. In those hours, the past wasn't distant. It was present, close as your breath.
The medieval world was not oblivious to the stench it lived in. People didn't walk through rivers of waste with numb nostrils and vacant expressions. They noticed, they suffered, and they fought back with whatever they had. Long before the rise of modern hygiene, medieval men and women developed their own olfactory defenses. Chief among them, scent. Cloying, pungent, overpowering scent. If you couldn't erase the smell of rot, you could mask it, chase it, drown it in roses and vinegar. Perfume, in its earliest form, was less about seduction and more about survival. The elite doused themselves in oils steeped with crushed flowers, herbs, or spices. These weren't delicate mists. They were potent mixtures, often alcohol or fat-based, rubbed directly onto skin, clothes, and even beards. Lavender for calm, rosemary for purification, clove and cinnamon for warmth. The idea wasn't just to smell pleasant, it was to counteract what surrounded you. For the commoner, these luxuries were out of reach, but they had their own methods. Dried herbs were hung in homes, sewn into pouches or tucked into sleeves. Some people carried pomanders, small perforated containers filled with fragrant materials. Others held nosegays, tiny floral bouquets pressed to the face in crowded streets. The smell of thyme or mint could help someone walk past an open gutter without retching. Public buildings, particularly churches, relied heavily on incense. Not only did it serve religious symbolism, but it provided a layer of scented smoke over the accumulated sweat and breath of packed congregations. Priests and parishioners alike believed that sweet smells were pleasing to God, and by contrast, that foul ones attracted the devil.
This belief ran deep. Medical theory of the time, particularly the miasma model, held that disease spread through corrupted air. If something smelled bad, it was dangerous. If it smelled good, it could be healing. Thus, a great deal of effort went into fumigating spaces with burning herbs or vinegars, especially during outbreaks of plague.
Homes were occasionally aired out by swinging smoking braziers through the rooms. Bed linens were sprinkled with rosewater or laid over fragrant shrubs in the sun. Walls were scrubbed with vinegar. Floors were strewn with rushes and herbs, both to absorb spills and emit scent when walked upon. In some cases, people chewed aromatic seeds like fennel or anise to keep their breath fresh and their spirits lifted. Yet despite the effort, it was a losing battle. The environment was too overwhelming. Open sewers ran down main streets. Butchers dumped animal blood near bakeries. Human waste mixed with horse dung in alleyways where children played. No amount of rosemary could truly compete. Still, the effort mattered, because to fight the smell was to fight despair. A well-scented handkerchief was not just a comfort, it was defiance. A noble's perfumed sleeve, a housewife's pot of boiling thyme, even the village healer's bundle of lavender. These were acts of resistance, tiny shields against the encroaching rot of daily life. And, of course, there were unintended consequences. Some perfumes, particularly those made with heavy oils or animal musks, attracted flies. Others clashed with the very odors they were meant to obscure, creating layers of conflicting smells that could nauseate more than soothe. But none of it was without intent. Scents were layered by purpose and occasion. A birth was marked by rose and myrrh, a funeral by laurel and juniper. A lover might wear jasmine, a soldier camphor or pine. Over time, these smells took on emotional resonance, reminders of people, places, and memories. The medieval nose was trained not just to endure, but to interpret.
And yet, even these olfactory strategies had social weight. To smell sweet was to be perceived as clean, virtuous, and pious. To reek of sweat or waste was to be marked as low, sinful, or even dangerous. In cities like Paris or London, accusations of illness often began with accusations of odor. A foul-smelling person might be avoided, quarantined, or attacked out of fear. Thus, smell became not just a personal concern, but a public one. Guilds enforced rules on tanners, dyers, and other smelly trades. Markets regulated how close butchers could operate near residences. In some cities, waste disposal was timed to avoid peak hours, but enforcement was lax and corruption ran deep. So people did what they could. They simmered herbs, they wore scented beads, they prayed, they adapted. Because to live in a medieval city was to live inside the breath of thousands, and to try with every petal and powder to breathe something better.
Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was rarely just about being clean. It was about virtue. It was about discipline. It was about keeping one's soul unspotted, even when the streets outside were lined with rotting waste and chamber pots poured from windows above. For most medieval Europeans, Washing was not only a physical act, it was a ritual gesture of moral clarity. At first glance, this might seem contradictory. After all, weren't medieval people famously filthy? Weren't baths rare, even feared, and bodies cloaked in grime? Yes and no. The full picture is more complicated. While access to soap and water was inconsistent and infrastructure limited, the idea of cleansing, of washing away sin and contagion, was embedded deeply into medieval life, particularly in public and religious spaces. Bathing had once been widespread in the Roman Empire, and remnants of this habit carried on in early medieval cities. In places like Paris, London, and Cologne, there were still public bathhouses, often small, dark, and wood-fired, but still operating. Many were shared by men and women, sometimes at different times, sometimes not. And though the church occasionally frowned on mixed bathing, the practice persisted well into the 14th century. A hot bath was not a daily occurrence, but it wasn't unheard of either. In fact, one of the most common public services offered in cities, along with barbers and bakers, was the bath attendant. These establishments offered steam rooms, tubs, and even scented oils. For a few coins, a laborer could, at least occasionally, sit in the heat, scrub their skin, and forget the cold mud of the streets outside. Soap, when used, was often made from lye and animal fat, harsh on the skin, but effective enough.
But even where water was scarce, other cleansing rituals took hold. In monasteries and among the devout, hand-washing was frequent, not out of concern for bacteria, a concept not yet understood, but as a sign of spiritual readiness. Before prayer, before meals, before communion, hands were ritually washed, sometimes with perfumed water or herbal infusions like rosemary, thyme, or sage. And then there were the dry cleansings. In regions where water was less available or considered risky, particularly after the rise of fears that warm water opened the body to disease, people turned to powders, perfumes, and linen. Changing one's undergarments regularly, even if the body itself wasn't washed, became a form of cleanliness. Clean linen next to the skin was seen as protective. A well-to-do person might go through several changes of chemise or shirt in a week, believing it drew the impurities out of the body. Perfume played a key role in these practices. Scent was more than luxury, it was defense. The belief in miasma, or bad air, meant that disease was thought to spread through foul odors. To protect oneself, especially during plague years, people wore pomanders, small containers of herbs and spices around their necks or wrists. Street-side vendors sold bundles of dried lavender, mint, or wormwood. In cities like Florence and Avignon, it was common to find small stalls offering rosewater by the ladle. Even royalty was not exempt from the effort to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. Inventories from noble households include elaborate bathing equipment, wooden tubs lined with cloth, silver ewers for pouring water, and attendants tasked with heating the bath to just the right temperature. In some cases, the water was infused with violet petals or citrus rind, more for smell than effect. The act of bathing was, again, as symbolic as it was practical.
Yet bathing also became political. During outbreaks of plague, bathhouses were often closed, accused of spreading contagion. Some clerics warned that nudity and communal bathing invited sin, and several cities enacted curfews or bans. In places like Paris, bathhouses dwindled in number, replaced by smaller private arrangements. And as the Renaissance dawned, fear of water entered the medical mainstream, leading to the paradox of the perfumed nobleman who had not bathed in months but changed his shirt daily and carried a scented handkerchief. Still, ordinary people found ways to fight the smell. In towns with public fountains, residents filled jugs of water daily, not just for cooking, but for dabbing themselves, rinsing feet, or scrubbing away mud from their calves and arms. On feast days and holy occasions, even the poorest tried to appear presentable. Faces washed, hair combed, shoes cleaned with rags or straw. Saints, too, played a role in how people understood cleanliness. Some were admired for their physical purity, such as Saint Agnes or Saint Catherine, while others were revered despite filth, their refusal to bathe seen as a sign of spiritual devotion. St. Thomas Becket reportedly washed the feet of the poor every night before his murder. In the folk imagination, cleansing was both act and metaphor, and it carried weight far beyond hygiene. In some, while the medieval world may not have smelled fresh by modern standards, the people who lived in it did not simply accept filth. They invented systems, rituals, and beliefs to cope with it, ways to stay spiritually and socially clean even when water and soap were scarce. And in doing so, they left behind a culture of cleanliness that, though imperfect and uneven, was never truly absent. Because even amid the smoke and rot, there were hands reaching for rosewater, fingers drawing crosses in steam, and quiet moments in the middle of chaos where someone, somewhere, tried to wash the world away.
In the heart of medieval cities, where waste flowed freely and chamber pots emptied into alleys, a peculiar industry began to thrive, the trade in scent. Not luxury perfume as we think of it today, but scent in every form. Dried herbs, oils, vinegars, burnt resins, citrus peel, and mystery mixtures sold in waxed packets or glass vials. Some promised love, others claimed to cure plague, most promised to cover the stink. At the edge of crowded markets, you could find them, scent hawkers. They stood beside butchers, spice dealers, and candle makers, but their merchandise was ephemeral, invisible, intangible, and yet incredibly valuable. Their stalls were modest, often just a wooden board draped with cloth, but their language was rich. They didn't sell products, they sold protection, they sold illusion, and they sold hope. The most common offerings were simple: rosemary bundles tied with string, lavender wrapped in linen, dried orange peels soaked in vinegar. These were affordable to most working-class Parisians and could be hung near windows or stuffed into garments. For a few deniers, you could buy a waxy pomander, a ball filled with cloves, cinnamon, and sometimes a sliver of musk, suspended from a chain or pinned to a belt. But then came the more ambitious products. Sellers offered so-called Four Thieves vinegar,
a legendary blend of herbs and acids said to have protected grave robbers during the plague. Whether this mixture ever worked was irrelevant. People believed, and belief, especially in desperate times, was more profitable than truth. There were powders meant to be burned in corners of the home, releasing a cleansing smoke. There were healing scents, concoctions that claimed to drive out devils, bad humors, and foul vapors. Some included real medicinal herbs like thyme or sage. Others included ground-up horn, bat's blood, usually animal fat mixed with dye, or stone oil, a smelly mineral paste scraped from damp walls and sold as holy.
The sellers themselves were an odd assortment. Some were genuine apothecaries, trained in herb lore, passed down through monasteries and guilds. Others were charlatans, theatrical, persuasive, and deeply aware of what their customers wanted to believe. They knew how to dress their part, robes that smelled of rosewater, amulets on strings, fingers stained with crushed petals. They shouted claims, whispered secrets, and often disappeared after selling a particularly expensive vial. In cities like Avignon or Florence, where trade routes brought exotic imports, scent became big business. Musk from the east, frankincense from Africa, ambergris from the coast. These were not just perfumes, but symbols of status and sophistication. Nobles competed over the rarest scents. Royal courts had appointed noses, officials whose job was to select and blend personalized aromas for their patrons. The closer you were to royalty, the better your scent. But for the common folk, scent was more urgent than decorative. It was a shield. A mother might hang a sachet of crushed mint in her child's cot to ward off sickness. A baker might keep sage leaves near the oven to mask the smell of spoiled flour. Even criminals took advantage, carrying false scents to distract dogs or disguise themselves during a theft. The church, too, understood the power of smell. Incense wasn't just sacred, it was strategic. In tightly packed cathedrals filled with unwashed bodies, swinging a thurible of burning frankincense wasn't just for symbolism, it helped people breathe. Holy water was sometimes infused with herbs. Monks sprinkled lavender on altars or burned juniper to cleanse the air before a sermon. Heaven, after all, was supposed to smell better than the street outside.
As the Black Death swept across Europe in waves, the scent industry boomed. Fear made people irrational and eager. Markets overflowed with miracle mixtures. Some vendors even sold cloths touched by saints or phials of plague-proof oil blessed in secret. In truth, many of these were scams. Some contained rancid fat or cheap wine. Others were outright dangerous, with mercury, arsenic, and hallucinogenic herbs like henbane included for dramatic effect. City officials tried to intervene. Edicts were issued, licenses revoked, but the trade continued, too profitable and too hard to trace. The demand was endless, and the sellers knew how to adapt. When certain ingredients became expensive, they faked them. When regulations increased, they changed their pitch. This is not a cure, one vendor might say with a wink,
but it will help you smell like you're already cured. And amid all the false promises, there were still moments of kindness. A midwife might boil a pot of thyme and let its steam fill a sick room. A widow might give her last packet of dried rose petals to a coughing child. A beggar might carry a sprig of rue, not to sell, but to press to his own nose when the sewers overflowed. Scent in medieval cities was not just a luxury or superstition, it was a coping mechanism, a rebellion against the rot, a gesture, sometimes desperate, sometimes dignified, to push back against the overwhelming odor of decay. In the end, whether the concoctions worked mattered less than the fact that people kept trying. They mixed, they boiled, they sold and believed, because hope, however it smelled, was better than nothing.
To step into a medieval bathhouse was to enter a world of contradictions, a place of cleanliness and suspicion, intimacy and judgment, steam and silence. In a city choking with filth, the bathhouse stood out as a space where the rules were temporarily suspended. Bodies undressed, barriers dropped, and for a brief time people could imagine themselves purified, even if only from the outside. Bathing in the Middle Ages wasn't as rare as many believe. Public and private bathhouses flourished across Europe, especially in cities with access to clean water via aqueducts, rivers or wells. Paris, London, Nuremberg and Prague all had districts known for their steam rooms, hot tubs and massage chambers. Some were lavish, adorned with tiles and scented cloths. Others were little more than wooden huts with a fire-heated tub in the center. The ritual usually began with a rinse, warm water poured over the body, often by an attendant. Next came the sweat, time spent in a hot, steamy room meant to open pores and soften skin. Then scrubbing. Coarse cloths, sponges, or even sand were used to remove dirt and dead skin. Finally, the soak, a shared tub or individual basin filled with warm, sometimes scented water. For those who could afford it, luxury was layered on top. Rose oil in the water, clean linen robes for afterward, musicians playing softly outside the chamber, wine or mead brought to the side of the tub. In some cities, bathing became a social event, a mix of hygiene, gossip, and performance. Men and women bathed together in certain places, separated in others, but the line between decorum and indulgence was often thin.
And that's where the bathhouse earned its uneasy reputation. The church viewed these places with skepticism, not because bathing was inherently sinful, but because of what might follow. Where bodies gathered unclothed, temptation followed. In times of plague or famine, when morality was policed more strictly, bathhouses were seen as sites of potential corruption. Clerics warned of lust and disease, spreading not through water, but through proximity. Yet for many, the bathhouse was essential, not a luxury, but a necessity. For laborers, it was the only escape from sweat-caked skin and infected wounds. For midwives and barbers, it doubled as a workplace. For the poor, it was an access point to dignity.
Even the very ill were sometimes carried to bathhouses in hopes that steam and herbs could ease their pain. The atmosphere inside was rarely silent. Bathers chatted about market prices, recent funerals, politics, or the changing weather. Children laughed and splashed. Old men argued over how hot the water should be. The sound of water being poured, firewood crackling under the boiler, and low voices bouncing off wet walls created a unique kind of music, one of living, ordinary care.
And when plague came, they were the first to close. Fear of contagion quickly turned bathhouses into ghosts. Tubs emptied, fires died out, doors shuttered. In some cities, authorities burned benches and scrubbed walls with vinegar. Steam, once seen as healing, became suspicious. Water, once soothing, became a possible vector for death. The very thing that had comforted people in better days became terrifying. Some bathhouses never reopened. Others pivoted, transforming into washhouses for clothing, bakeries, or workshops. A few remained, but rebranded, emphasizing their cleanliness, their herbs, their separate chambers, anything to distance themselves from suspicion. Yet the memory of the bathhouse lingered. In literature and song, it remained a place of sensuality and satire. In paintings, it was often depicted with a mix of reverence and ridicule, half sanctified, half scandalous. And in the minds of those who had once sat in the warm water and exhaled the city's stink from their lungs, it was remembered not for its risks, but for its relief. Today, few of those bathhouses survive. Their timbers rotted, their stones buried under streets and apartments. But the ritual remains, not in exact form, but in spirit. The need to wash away the world, the need for pause, the need, even now, to feel clean in a place that rarely is. In the medieval city, where rot clung to every doorway and disease crouched in every alley, the bathhouse was a brief rebellion, a fragile gesture, a quiet place where for a moment you could be human again.
To smell rich in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of perfume, it was a matter of politics. In a world where most of the population reeked of toil, rot, and smoke, the ruling class distinguished themselves not only by their clothing or speech, but also by the very air they carried with them. The nobility didn't just smell better, they smelled deliberately different. It began with the body. Wealth allowed for frequent washing, private baths, and the application of oils and scented waters, while the average townsman might bathe once a month, if at all. A noblewoman could soak weekly, her water infused with lavender, orange blossom, or rose. Hair was washed with vinegars steeped in herbs. Hands were rubbed with balm made from honey and thyme. Even armpits were scented, not with deodorant, but with little cloth sachets tied under the sleeves, filled with crushed rosemary or clove. Clothing was another layer of the olfactory divide. Fine fabrics absorbed and retained scent. Linen shirts, woolen tunics, and silk gowns were hung near smoking pots of herbs or dried flowers. Cedar wood chests infused garments with sharp, clean aromas.
Scented pomanders, decorative orbs filled with spices and resins were worn on belts or carried in gloves. For nobility, it wasn't just about masking body odor. It was about surrounding oneself with a field of fragrance that signaled refinement and control. The rooms they inhabited carried this message further. Castle halls and manor bedrooms were routinely perfumed, not only to counter the natural smells of stone, smoke, and sweat, but to broadcast luxury. Boughs of fresh herbs were laid on floors. Incense was burned before guests arrived. Bowls of dried petals and crushed juniper sat in corners. In the height of court fashion, perfumed fountains were even constructed, their water laced with rose oil or violet essence.
Scent, like speech, became coded. A certain note of jasmine might be associated with foreign trade. Musk implied sensuality and boldness. Frankincense was ecclesiastical, implying piety or a churchly connection. Myrrh hinted at royalty and ancient lineage. The layering of these aromas acted as a kind of olfactory heraldry, announcing rank, origin, and even temperament before a word was spoken. This distinction wasn't lost on the lower classes. Many aspired to emulate the scents of their betters, even if only through imitation. In market stalls, vendors sold cheaper versions of noble perfumes, diluted lavender water, sachets of dried mint, or combs rubbed with lemon peel. While access to true luxury was limited, the desire to smell upward was widespread. To smell clean was to suggest you had time to be clean. To smell of herbs was to hint at proximity to gardens, not gutters. But the politics of smell extended beyond aspiration. They also became mechanisms of exclusion. Courtly gatherings and formal dinners often used scent to enforce boundaries. A servant who entered a chamber reeking of fish or stable was subtly shamed. Apprentices who could not afford scented soaps were kept at the periphery. Even illness had its scent associations. The breath of the sick, the rot of wounds, the sour tang of sweat, all marked one as socially suspect. Physicians carried pomanders not only for protection against miasma, but to avoid the offense of proximity to the unclean. And then there were laws. Sumptuary regulations meant to enforce social order sometimes included restrictions on scented goods. In certain cities, only nobles could purchase imported perfumes. Some monasteries banned the use of scent altogether, equating it with vanity and excess. In courts, the right to certain scented materials, especially rare imports like ambergris or oud, was regulated like gold. Smell was not just indulgence, it was territory.
Ironically, it was this obsession with fragrant identity that made the ruling class so vulnerable during times of unrest. As famine and plagues swept through Europe, and the poor buried their dead in trenches while the rich dined in perfumed halls, scent became a symbol of detachment. To smell too clean, too floral, too above it all, was to invite suspicion. In pamphlets and plays, nobles were mocked not only for their wealth, but for their aromas, their overly sweet sleeves, their gardens of artificial flowers, their halls that smelled of spice while grain rotted in the streets. The revolution didn't just target palaces, it targeted perfumes. During uprisings, nobles were sometimes identified and dragged out by the way they smelled. Scent, once protection, became betrayal.
Records tell of rebel guards searching coaches not for gold, but for perfumed gloves or boxes of scent, sure signs that someone within was too refined to be one of us. And so, for a time, the aristocracy began to scrub themselves clean of their own signatures. Perfumes were hidden, herbal sachets burned. The wealthy tried to smell anonymous, neutral. But it was too late. Scent, like memory, lingered. Today, the idea of smelling rich has been commercialized, bottled, and democratized. But in the medieval world, it was a privilege with sharp edges, one that could elevate or endanger, seduce or condemn. To walk into a noble's chamber in the 14th century was to enter a world of scent layered as carefully as velvet. Every breath reminded you of who you were and who you were not.
For the medieval poor, scent wasn't a luxury, it was a burden. It clung to them like mud on boots, like smoke in fabric, like something they could neither shed nor hide. In a world stratified by class, smell became more than a sensory detail. It became identity. And for those on the bottom, it was an inescapable marker of exclusion. To be poor in the Middle Ages was, by default, to live close to filth. It meant narrow alleys with open drains. It meant homes without chimneys, where firewood smoked up the rafters and soot coated the walls. It meant sleeping near animals for warmth, pigs, chickens, goats, whose stink mingled with your own. It meant labor, hauling, tanning, blacksmithing, dyeing, all jobs steeped in reek. But more than that, it meant not having the time or the means to wash. Water was precious, soap was expensive, and even when you could clean yourself, your clothes, often your only set, reabsorbed the stench of the street within hours. No matter how clean your skin, your station smelled of rot and work and neglect. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was social death. The noses of the upper class were trained, or claimed to be trained, to detect poverty. A whiff of sour sweat, of dank wool, of onions or ash, and one was labelled peasant, beggar, servant. In court, in church, even in market spaces, the poor were watched and sometimes literally sniffed for signs that they didn't belong. Odour became surveillance.
There were efforts to mask it. Some workers carried sprigs of herbs stuffed into belts or hats. Others chewed mint or cloves, not for health, but to avoid offending employers. A few who worked near luxury, chambermaids, cooks, stable boys, might catch traces of wealth's perfume and try to mimic it, but the result was often worse. The mix of labour's stink and counterfeit scent became an insult to both classes. Worse still was the association between smell and morality. The medieval mind linked foul odours with sin. The devil, it was said, stank of brimstone. Hell reeked of rot. To be foul-smelling was to be suspected of spiritual corruption. Priests wrote sermons about the stench of the soul, and some even argued that the poor's odour was evidence of their divine punishment. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was godliness. This doctrine trickled down into daily life. Poor parishioners were seated near church doors, not just because of status,
but because their stench might offend those seated near the altar. In guild halls, apprentices ate separately from masters. In court, a peasant might be denied entry altogether if he was deemed too ripe. The smell of poverty became a reason to avoid, to exclude, to punish. Children weren't spared. Peasant children were born into the same odours and bore the same stigma. In towns, noble women covered their noses when crossing paths with ragged boys. In wealthier homes, servants were instructed to wash after touching the poor. Even charitable acts, the giving of bread or alms, were sometimes accompanied by a scented cloth held to the face. And yet the poor endured. They found moments of dignity amid the stink. Communal baths were precious. Rainfall was welcomed as a brief cleanser. Some cities had public fountains, and while meant for drawing water, they became unofficial wash spots. Mothers scrubbed children. Labourers rinsed faces. There was pride, even among the poor, in being the cleanest in the alley.
But even that came with risk. To appear too clean as a poor person was suspicious. It hinted at vanity or rebellion. It invited ridicule, or worse, accusations of thievery. How else could they afford it? Or witchcraft? What else could explain the scent? The poor were expected to smell poor, not only by the rich, but by each other. It was a kind of enforced solidarity. Anyone who tried to rise above was reminded sharply of their place. And so scent became a kind of prison. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about control. By the late medieval period, as towns grew and cities thickened, efforts were made, half-heartedly, to manage urban stench. Waste disposal laws were passed. Tanneries were relocated. But enforcement was weak, and the wealthy often bribed their way out of compliance. It was still the poor who lived near the cesspits, the butcher stalls, the latrines. It was still the poor who bore the brunt of society's stink. This scent divide became even more pronounced in times of disease. During outbreaks, especially the Black Death, scent became fear incarnate. The miasma theory of disease, which held that illness spread through bad air, led to widespread panic. The poor, already blamed for crime, laziness, and sin, were now accused of carrying plague through their very odour. Some were chased from towns, others were sealed in homes. More died anonymously, buried in pits, their scent never forgotten. And yet, amid all this, the poor of the medieval world did not disappear. They endured. They built. They carried burdens, and they passed down stories. And while their names might not be etched in stone, their scent, however foul, however fleeting, was part of the very air of history.
Among the privileged, scent was not just an accessory, it was a barrier. A fragrant wall built not only to please the senses, but to repel the rest of the world. In the courts and salons of medieval Europe, perfume became a signal of refinement, of rank, and of refusal to share in the common air. The upper classes didn't merely wish to smell good, they wished to smell different, to live in an olfactory space entirely their own, free of sewage, free of sweat, free of the poor, and they had the means to do it. Perfume, as it emerged in medieval Europe, was a mixture of art and alchemy. Distilled from rare ingredients, rose petals, ambergris, civet, musk, sandalwood, it required time,
money, and access to distant trade routes. Many of the base materials came from Africa, the Middle East, or the far reaches of Asia. This gave scent an immediate geopolitical dimension. A perfume was not just a smell, it was proof of global reach. Royal households often maintained dedicated perfumers. These were not apothecaries, but specialists who crafted signature scents for noble families. Recipes were closely guarded. Some were designed to mask illness, others to enhance perceived virtues, innocence, virility, piety. Queen Isabella of France reportedly wore a perfume of violet and myrrh meant to convey both humility and sacred grace. Louis IX was said to bathe weekly in rosewater, a staggering indulgence at the time. But fragrance extended beyond the body. It perfumed clothes, gloves, hair, linens. Servants brushed scented powders into tapestries and hung sachets in wardrobes. Perfumed wax was used to seal letters. Even handkerchiefs, still a novelty, were soaked in lavender or verbena before being pressed to the nose when crossing the street.
It wasn't just about smell, it was about presence. When a noble entered a room, their scent arrived first, a declaration, a warning, a performance. And when they left, it lingered, a trace of them, a reminder of power. The church, too, embraced fragrance, but with caution. Incense had long been part of religious rituals, meant to purify spaces and elevate the spirit. Frankincense and myrrh were seen as holy substances. Yet the overlap between sacred and profane was always tense. A bishop who smelled too luxurious might be accused of vanity. A noblewoman who wore musk to mass could provoke whispers about impropriety. To navigate this, a careful vocabulary of scent evolved. Certain perfumes became associated with certain times of day, certain occasions, certain ranks. Too much, or the wrong type, was seen as gauche. Perfume became etiquette, and etiquette in medieval Europe was another word for power. This extended to public health, or rather the illusion of it. The belief that foul air caused disease led the rich to surround themselves with clean scents. Pomanders, ornate balls filled with herbs and spices, were carried by the elite, swung gently from chains or clasped in gloves. Nobles held them beneath their noses when forced to walk among the common crowd. Physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic material, believing scent could ward off contagion. But more often, it simply created distance, a perfumed moat around the body. That distance was political. In a world where space was limited and bodies pressed close, in markets, in churches, even in homes, scent allowed the powerful to control their atmosphere. It dictated who could approach, who was tolerated, who was cast out.
Some courtiers, desperate for advancement, invested in scent over sustenance. Gloves were soaked in cologne. Wigs were dusted with iris root. A single vial of attar could cost more than a month's wages, and yet it was spent because scent opened doors. It earned smiles. It invited touch. But this obsession had its limits. There were scandals of perfumers who used rotting animal products, of nobles who wore overpowering scents to hide disease. There were whispers about women whose perfume was too bold, too sensual. There were suspicions that some scents weren't just cosmetic,
but magical. Certain perfumes were banned under suspicion of containing aphrodisiacs or poisons. In a few cases, women were accused of witchcraft simply for possessing too many fragrant oils. Still, the scented elite remained largely untouchable. In their salons, surrounded by lavender and rosewater, they debated politics and poetry. Outside, the streets reeked, but inside, behind velvet curtains and perfumed veils, the air was curated. It was an olfactory utopia, built on distance. And the poor? They smelled it too, drifting through open windows, clinging to coins, hovering in chapels. The scent of power was everywhere and nowhere, a reminder of where they could not go, of who they could not be. But scent, like power, is never permanent. As cities expanded and markets grew, perfumery became democratized. By the late 15th century, small bottles of floral water could be found in urban stalls. Recipes leaked, guilds shifted, the fragrant wall thinned, just slightly. Still, in the medieval world, to be scented was to be noticed, to leave a trail of something sweet behind you, even as the world rotted, was to say, I am above this. I do not belong to the smell of the street. And that, perhaps, was the greatest luxury of all.
As the divide between the scented few and the stinking many widened, so too did the resentment that clung to it. The late medieval city was a paradox, rich with fragrance, yet soaked in rot. And it was in this clash between perfumed illusions and festering reality that smell itself became a kind of rebellion. The poor did not have access to the perfumes of nobility. They did not carry pomander, nor did their clothes carry notes of rose or civet. What they had was familiarity with stink. They lived next to butchers and tanners, trudged through streets slick with waste, shared sleeping quarters with animals. They didn't ignore the smell, they adapted to it. The body acclimated, the nose stopped flinching. But over time, that tolerance hardened into something more than survival. It became identity. And identity, especially when forced to kneel before something false, eventually resists. By the 14th century, the critique of perfume society wasn't just whispered, it was performed. In satirical plays, noblewomen were mocked for bathing in flower water while their tenants died of dysentery. In street ballads, the scent of jasmine was mocked as a cover for cruelty. And in visual art, the act of perfuming one's body was increasingly associated with moral decay. To smell too sweet was to be rotten beneath. The clearest examples came during moments of social tension, famines, plagues, grain riots. When bread ran out, the smell of lavender wasn't just offensive, it was inflammatory. Crowds could turn violent at the sight of a noble carriage trailing rosewater into a starving neighborhood. There are records of perfume shops being vandalized, of nobles being pelted with dung. The nose became a battleground. This wasn't merely anger at wealth, it was anger at the audacity to pretend the city didn't stink. To the commoner, perfume was not refinement, it was denial. It was erasure. And the stench of the city became proof of injustice, a tangible thing clinging to every alley that the perfumed elite refused to acknowledge. Reformers seized on this. Religious figures, especially in the later medieval period, began to preach about the moral odor of society. Some equated physical cleanliness with spiritual filth. The more someone masked their smell, the more they were hiding something within. Scent became a metaphor for false piety, for decadence, for the corruption of the soul. Sermons described hell not only as fire, but as the stench of deceit. A body too fragrant was now a suspect one. And yet something subtler happened too. Among the emerging middle classes, the bakers, the scribes, the tradesmen, a new kind of olfactory identity formed, one that rejected both extremes, the rank rot of poverty and the theatrical perfume of the court. Instead, they turned to modest cleanliness, soap, herbs, boiled linens hung to dry in courtyards. They didn't aim to smell rich, they aimed to smell honest. These practices weren't always noticed, but they mattered. In guild halls and domestic spaces, in emerging urban codes, scent began to be codified as a kind of quiet virtue. A clean-smelling man was trustworthy. A modestly fragrant woman was respectable. Scent became not just a sense, but a signal, and the elite noticed.
Some nobles began turning down their use of fragrance. Others adopted more earthy scents, rosemary, thyme, even cedar, to appear more in touch with the public mood. A few nobles even ordered their perfumers to study common practices, seeking to mimic them. But it rarely worked. The performance was too thin, too late. During the early sparks of revolution in France and elsewhere, the assault on the senses was deliberate. Protesters lit dung fires near palaces. They defaced perfumed chapels. They flooded elite events with stink bombs, sometimes just dead fish or spoiled meat. It was crude, but it worked. The message was clear. You cannot separate your breath from ours. Smell had always been a tool of division. Now it was a weapon of collapse. The irony is that even in rebellion, people never truly rejected scent. They just reclaimed it. They insisted on a world where smell was shared, where the streets and the salons inhaled the same air, where no one floated above on clouds of jasmine while children starved beneath. And in the ruins of old perfume houses, long after revolts passed, new shops opened. They sold simpler mixtures, lavender vinegar for cleaning, rosemary oil for wounds, not luxury, utility, not status, survival. These weren't declarations of power, they were declarations of presence. In the end, the rebellion of the nose wasn't just about scent, it was about being smelled, about no longer being ignored, about insisting that you couldn't wash away inequality with rose water. Because the city did stink, but for once, everyone had to breathe it.
By now, the city has grown quieter. The sun has long set behind its crooked roofs, the butchers have closed their stalls, and the last baker has swept his threshold clean. But the smells, they linger. They always did. You've walked its narrow streets, felt the damp between stones, the warmth of the ovens, the sting of chamber pots emptied too near your boots. You've passed beneath drying linens steeped in vinegar, and beside churches where incense still battles mildew. You've tasted the air, whether you meant to or not. And in doing so, you've walked through something few ever speak of when they mention history. Not battles, not kings, not dates, but breath. Because that's what the past was, more than anything. A world lived with the nose first. Before electricity, before antiseptics, before sealed windows and indoor plumbing. Life was inhaled. The body knew where it was by scent. It recognized safety by the smell of bread, danger by the whiff of rot, comfort by a sprig of rosemary or a wisp of smoke curling from a fire. And while we often speak of how people lived in the past, we forget how they smelled it.
What it meant to carry the stink of one's trade, to mask a wound with herbs, to be judged by the perfume, or lack of it, that clung to your skin. To live in a world where the nose decided more than fashion. It decided trust, rank, suspicion, and shame. But more than all of that, it was honest. Today, scent is often artificial, sanitized, concealed, curated for shelves and ads. But back then, it was real, immediate, and in that realness was a truth few paintings capture, that every great hall stank of sweat, every monastery reeked of wax and mold, and every city square bore the imprint of everything that came before. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is how we know it was alive. Not from its monuments or manuscripts, but from the invisible trail it left in the air. So tonight, as you drift away, think not of the grand or the glorious. Think instead of the simple breath of another time, of a world that reeked and steamed and lingered. A world not forgotten, but still floating faintly in the quiet corners of memory. Thank you for walking with me. I'm Boris, and I'll be here next time when the past opens another door.